Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. For those who are joining us the first time, my name is Alina Bonadonna, and I will be a moderator of today's session. I'm honored to be joined by Frank Yiannas, former Deputy Commissioner for Food Safety and Policy and Response at the FDA. So, welcome, Frank. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure as well. And using the opportunity, I would love to thank to Nemis Technologies for supporting such young but super strong and powerful educational project like our academy. And as far as I see already, quite a lot of people in the waiting room, not in the waiting room, sorry, waiting until we start. And that's why before we get started, I just ask you guys to do a very, very quick technical checkup to ensure that everything works good. So please press on the button on the bottom left just to shoot on the best reaction you think for today, just to let us know that everything is working. Yeah, I see reactions are coming. Amazing. Amazing. And guys, today we have just tremendous number of participants and it's amazing as of course, definitely. And that's why I encourage you to shoot on questions during the session. So after QA, after presentation, we will have a bit of time for QA and select the sharpest questions for Frank. So I will not take more time and please join me in welcoming Frank Yanis. Frank, the floor is 100% yours.
Thank you, Elena. Very gracious, very gracious. Let me make sure. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, let me say good morning from the US. I know we have an international audience and people tuning in from around the world. Thank you for joining. I mean that very sincerely. And thank you for your commitment to continual learning. You know, it's somewhat still the start of a new year, and I am just so encouraged that food safety professionals all over the world are always searching on how can we do our jobs better, how can we further reduce food safety risk and protect consumers. Alina, grateful to you and Nimbus Technologies for hosting this webinar. You know, there's a lot that I could talk to you about today as the former deputy commissioner at the US FDA. You might be interested in what is USDA or US FDA doing with the new food traceability rule, something that I was very involved with. There have been actions here in the United States with banning red dye 3. There's a new regulation regarding agricultural water. And of all the things that we could be talking about today, I have to tell you very sincerely that I think the topic that Nemesis asked me to talk about, food safety culture, might be one of the most important ones. And I want you to remember this mental idea. The reason I feel so strongly that this is one of the most important topics is that what I've learned over 35 years in this profession is that having a strong food safety culture is what I call a prerequisite. That's right, a prerequisite to effective food safety management. You see, we can have the best risk assessments, the best policies, the best rules, in some cases, laws in the world. But if we can't get people to put them into practice, they're absolutely useless. So, food safety culture is a prerequisite to effective food safety management. Now, I want to share a little bit about my background, real brief. I started my career many, many years ago. I spent almost 20 years working for the Disney company, where I oversaw food safety. I eventually oversaw occupational safety and health, guest safety, and a host of other safety issues at Disney theme parks and resorts. And after 20 years of working for a mouse, I like to say, I decided to make a major career change and I joined the Walmart organization that you'll see there in the center. People often ask me, well, why would you leave such a wonderful company like Disney to go work for Walmart? At least in our country here in the US, Walmart has a pretty big market share. They are a global retailer, but in the US alone, 1 out of every $4 that's spent on food in the United States is spent at a Walmart store. So if you want to make a difference in food, Walmart would be a pretty good place to be. Spent 10 years there as their global vice president of food safety, and might have interacted with many of you with the initiatives such as becoming the first U.S. retailer to require GFSI and work that we did with blockchain on food traceability. But in 2018, after 10 years at Walmart, I decided to make a major career change and go from the private sector to the public sector and join the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And so I like to joke that I went from the happiest place on earth, the Disney company, to the busiest place on earth, Walmart supercenters. And I ended up and if we were live, I'd ask you to fill in the blank. And sometimes people would take shots at the FDA, but I like to say one of the most important and prestigious regulatory agencies on earth. So I'm going to try to share a lifetime in food safety of lessons surrounding food safety culture. Now, let me start off a little bit less traditional, and I like to do this and ask the audience, and we'll have to do this virtually, but if in person, I would say, what does this picture have to do with what we're going to talk about here today? And if we were in person, one of the first responses I hear is people will say, Frank, well, that's a picture of the space shuttle, part of the NASA program, the space program in the United States. And that probably means you're trying to convey something about HACCP, because many of you know HACCP, one of the most basic risk management models we use to manage food safety risk, was invented by NASA in Pillsbury, trying to avoid astronauts from experiencing a foodborne illness when they went into space. Another answer that I often get, well, Frank, you're talking about, charging for new innovation, new and emerging technologies. And there's a host of responses and answers that I generally receive, but I want you right now to think about what you thought of when I said, what do you think this picture has to do with this webinar? And we're going to come back to it in just a few minutes. The next question I like to ask, again, intentionally being provocative, and it is my very favorite question to ask of food safety professionals all over the world. And I literally have asked this question in 2024 in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Norway, Japan, the UK, Canada, the US, Mexico. And when I ask this question of food safety professionals all over the world, are we winning the battle against foodborne disease? And I pause. Generally, and these are large audiences, sometimes 400, 500, 600 people. We have, I think, close to 700 online today. The number one and the most common response I get is, no, Frank, we are not winning the battle against foodborne disease. I don't know what you're thinking of, but oftentimes people will say, no, we're not winning the battle. There are times when people will say, well, Frank, we're winning some battles, but we're not winning the war. Oftentimes people will say, hey, Frank, well, the battles are changing, Frank. The battles we're fighting today against foodborne disease are different than the battles that we fought in years past. But the number one response, very candidly, colleagues, is that people will tell me, I don't think we're winning the battles. Now, I like the answer that we've won many battles, but the battles today are a little bit different. And what I'm sharing with you here is a slide that I got from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where I asked them, listen, we've been working on food safety for well over 100 years. If you look at what food safety professionals, we would call them sanitarians at that time, at the dawn of the 20th century, were working on, at least in the US, this is what the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention gave to me. This is the listing they literally gave me. Well, Frank, these were the pathogens of concern, 100 years ago. And you could see the types of pathogens. And I like to joke when you look at this slide, say, I doubt many of you are worried about tapeworms or have tapeworms in your HACCP plan. The other thing I like to do if I have the audience live in front of me is say, what pathogens do you not see on this list or on this slide? To really draw into illustration this idea that the battles are changing. Well, what do you not see? You do not see listeria, listeriosis, something that we've seen a lot in the news and many of us are concerned about. What else don't you see? You don't see Shiga toxin producing E. coli or E. coli 157 in particular. What else don't you see? You don't see Campylobacter. You don't see norovirus, the number one cause of foodborne disease. You don't see pathogens just like cyclospora. And then if you started looking at some of the things we're concerned about now, moving away from microbiological hazards to chemical hazards, you don't see PFAS or you don't see uh, certain food additives. And so the battles that we're facing today, the battles that you and I, all of you paying attention today, I think are different battles. And I actually describe them as last mile battles that I think are a little bit more challenging than some of the battles that we've won in the past. The battles are getting harder, in my opinion. And why do people say, Frank, I don't think we're winning the battle against foodborne disease? Well, I like to say, just think about what happened in 2024, at least in my hemisphere. There was almost what I would describe as a weekly, maybe even daily drumbeat of food recalls and food outbreaks being reported. I described a few. I could have developed many slides of the outbreaks that occurred in 2024, but you can see some of the headlines that concerned me in 24. This was a large cantaloupe outbreak that affected all of North America. That means the US and Canada. 15 deaths reported in combination between these two countries due to salmonella on cantaloupes. And we've seen reoccurring outbreaks with cantaloupes here in North America. The center picture is one that I suspect people all over the world have heard, but it was an outbreak associated with these pouches of applesauce marketed and destined specifically for children that were flavored cinnamon. And the cinnamon that was used to flavor the applesauce for kids had very high levels of lead. And in our country, we had hundreds of kids becoming poisoned with lead because the company did not do a proper risk assessment uh, and not take into account what I would describe as a reasonably foreseeable hazard, you know, uh, lead in spices. And the bottom picture is not to pick on this world famous brand, but a global brand having an outbreak and really drawing into illustration this idea that when it comes to food safety, it's every product, every facility, every location, every employee, every ingredient. And I can go on, but these headlines in 2024 certainly made us feel like we're not winning the battle against foodborne disease. Let me talk a little bit about recalls. This is another reason why people feel like, Frank, we're not winning the battle against foodborne disease. And that's because we're seeing a lot of recalls. One of the things I did, if you've not read this article, I would encourage you to do so. It was published in the Journal of Food Protection in January 2023. They looked at the number of food recalls that occurred in the United States due to US FDA regulated foods. And the FDA regulates 80% of the US food system in our country, 80%. And you can see over this 21-year period, there were about 35,000 plus food recalls. It's a lot of recalls. The number one reason, while people might think, hey, it's allergens, actually, if you look at the recalls and categorize them with specificity, the number one recall was due to listeria, and we're still seeing a lot of listeria recalls to this day. And while the recalls didn't occur consistently over time, just to make a point, if you just calculated them over the number of days over those years, it was equivalent to about 5 recalls per day. That's a lot of recalls. So that doesn't make us feel. And I know some people will say, well, Frank, recalls are a sign that the food system is working. With all due respect, to me, recalls are not a sign that the food system is working. I subscribe to the philosophy and mental models of Edward Deming that said the goal is not to detect defects, but to prevent them. And if you're having this many recalls, it means that your food production systems are not under control. Another reason why we feel like we're not winning is confidence in the ability of governments. This is a survey done in the United States by a very credible polling group, the Gallup polling organization, that shows trust in the US government ability to ensure food safety, this meaning consumers, saying whether they trust government's ability to ensure food safety is at an all-time low. And the last thing I'll say before we get onto this topic of culture is this is the number one reason why Frank Yiannas says we're not winning the battle against foodborne disease is based on CDC FoodNet data. I love this quote. You might have heard of it. It says, "In God we trust." If you're a person of faith, you might say, "In God we trust. For all others, bring data." That's another Edward Deming quote. So I say it doesn't matter what we feel about whether we're winning or losing the battle against foodborne disease. What does the data say? And in the United States, we have a really good foodborne disease surveillance system where we track foodborne illnesses over time. You can see over 20 years here on this graph by the dates on the x-axis. And we track large sections of the US population with what we call aggressive foodborne disease surveillance as opposed to passive, meaning we're going out and contacting hospitals and labs to see if there's foodborne illnesses being reported, as opposed to wait for them to be passively reported. And I just want to make this point, and we'll start transitioning to culture. But if you look on this slide here, you can see, let's take the light green salmonella. In 1996, there were about 15 cases of salmonellosis per 100,000 US population. If you fast forward to 2022, it's slightly higher than 15. Let's take Campylobacter in purple. And let's go down to the year 1999, where we had about 15. And you fast forward to 22, and you can see it's being reported slightly less than 20 cases. And you can pick your pathogen here. The bottom line is if you look across 20 years, the incidence, which is a good way to quantitatively look at this, the number of illnesses per population, a standardized population rate, the incidence of many foodborne pathogens have not changed much for almost 20 years, 2 decades. And I believe that I'm not going to be satisfied until we can bend the curve of foodborne illness, not continue to work to keep illness rates flat. Now, we could spend a lot of time saying, well, Frank, maybe there would have been a reduction, but we're getting better at measuring. That's true, but I don't think we can use that as a crutch. One of the reasons clearly is our ability to detect foodborne illnesses is getting better than ever before. We know we have tools such as whole genome sequencing. We know that we can rely on electronic records rather than relying on patients' memory history of what they consumed to see if we can determine links of people that are ill with certain products that have been purchased. And the bottom picture is an image of a study that was published in the Journal of Emerging Infectious Diseases, published by the CDC. And it has to do with the maple leaf outbreak that said, these researchers published and said, if we were looking at what Canadians at that time were looking on search engines such as Google, we might have detected the illnesses long before traditional health reporting, meaning people having to be ill enough to show up at a health department and get tested as positive. And so I'll use this analogy for you. I've used it for a few years, and colleagues, I've never thought this analogy is truer than it is today. And it's this, that everyone involved in food production, all 700 plus people that are watching this webinar, and more will watch it as we post it on the web. The battle or the race is between our ability to detect foodborne illnesses, which is getting very, very good because of the modern day in which we live. And that's a good thing. I love for countries to continue to make investments in foodborne disease detection. Are there people in populations that are becoming ill? Because that exposes the truth. But we're getting really good at that. And the race is between our ability to detect them and our ability to prevent them. And I believe we have to accelerate prevention. Just like we accelerated our ability to detect foodborne illnesses, we now have to accelerate our ability to prevent foodborne illnesses, or else we're going to lose the race. And let me just pause. So what I want you to do now is that you've seen the slide that says we're basically fairly flat, not making great progress on foodborne disease for about 20 years. I think there's never been a moment, at least in my 35-year career, that is more important than the moment that we have right now in front of us, the beginning of 25. And I think it's time for us, and I intentionally want to be a bit provocative with you. I want to challenge you to rethink food safety, rethink many of the assumptions that we've made. I think there's a lot we need to rethink. We need to rethink how we do risk assessments. I think we need to rethink the role of environmental monitoring and are we doing it sufficiently? And I do think part of this is the rethinking of what's the role of human behavior in organizational culture and so much more. And why is that? I love this quote from Albert Einstein that says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I just shared with you 20 years of foodborne disease incidence data that says we're not making a difference. What is going to change over the course of the next 10 years unless we do food safety differently? And so there's change. What got us here, I assure you, will not be what gets us there to the year 20. I tell companies that if you think you're going to do food safety in 2025 and 2026 like you did in 24 and 23, I suspect many of you will lose and get caught in foodborne illnesses and outbreaks. Now, why do I think we have to change? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. What I have seen over the course of my career is that we need to add new tools to our food safety toolbox. And the primary tools that I've seen us use, at least tools that I was trained on, were these three. Training, and I know many of you will say, well, Frank, the training that I do today is better than it was in years past. We're doing more interactive training. And I humbly will say, well, that's okay. But remember, we've been doing training a long time, and training in and of itself or alone doesn't impress me. We have another tool of inspections or audits. Some will say, Frank, we're doing better risk-based inspections than ever before. We're increasing the frequency of our audits or inspections. And I will say again, well, we've been doing inspections for a long time. That alone doesn't impress me. And then some will say, Frank, well, testing. And I'm a bench level microbiologist. I'm a microbiologist by training. I love microbiology. And some will say, Frank, we're using new techniques, rapid methods. And I'll say that's great, and we should, but testing alone doesn't impress me. Uh, and it reminds me of this quote, and take note that I'm using a quote not of a food scientist, but a quote from a behavioral scientist who says, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. And one of the things I want to do today is to have you come out of this webinar saying, listen, I need to add more tools to my toolbox. Uh, yeah, I have the tool of inspections, I have the tool of training and the tool of testing, but those tools aren't enough. So I want you to just pause and come along with me. Imagine Frank Yiannas was doing a demo for you today on this webinar where I was cutting raw chicken on a cutting board. And after I cut the raw chicken, I wiped the chicken parts to the side, barely rinsed that cutting board, instead started cutting a head of lettuce. What would that be? And if we were in person, many of you would shout cross-contamination. And I would say, wrong answer. It's a human behavior. If you look at the picture to the left there, that's a picture of a Walmart store. I used to tell people, what do you think my job or my role at Walmart is? Is it to write great HACCP plans, to do great risk assessments? And part of that certainly was true. But my job at Walmart, I used to say, was to be the chief food safety culture ambassador and try to influence the behaviors of literally, listen to this, 2.2 million employees around the world. Because I could never be in every store and every supplier at the right time. Neither could I have a big enough staff. And so we had to influence people to do the right things that we were hoping for them to do. And even when I worked in federal service at FDA, I used to tell my team there, our jobs aren't simply as regulators to write rules and regulations or to conduct inspections and to hold people accountable to compliance. Our jobs are to try to influence the behaviors of the tens of millions of people that work in the food and ag sector regulated by FDA. So my favorite definition of food safety, and it's one that I hope you will remember, is not a fancy codex definition, not a fancy academic definition. but it's that food safety equals behavior, nothing more and nothing less. You see, it's impossible to advance food safety in any organization of any size, in any jurisdiction, whether it's a county or state or country, uh, larger companies. It's impossible to advance food safety without influencing human behavior and attitudes, whether it's the behaviors and attitudes and decisions that the executives will make on whether they're going to make the investments or changes or buy capital equipment or introduce interventions to make food safety better in their companies, whether it's the mid-level leaders in the organizations that we know are so critical to making sure that food safety gets executed properly, or certainly the frontline employees that are working on the plant floor or on the floor in retail and food service establishments. You have to be able to influence human behavior because unfortunately, the reality is our food system is very people dependent. It's not all automated. We're a long, long ways from having complete automation where we don't rely on people. And we saw that in the pandemic. Why were there food shortages and snarled supply chains? Because when people become sick and they can't show up to work, food doesn't get produced and food doesn't get moved. And so food production is still largely a human endeavor. And it's impossible to advance food safety without better influencing human behavior. So how do we do that? You might be asking. Is it by creating better food safety programs? One of the things I'll encourage you to do is to try to strike the word food safety program or the term food safety program from your vocabulary and really start talking and thinking that it's about food safety culture. I think this is probably one of the most important jobs of a food safety professional is to strengthen the culture of food safety in the areas of responsibility that they work in. So in the time we have left, I'm going to try to answer four basic questions. One, what is a food safety culture? Why the focus on it? Who creates it? And then I'm going to try to whet your appetite with some ideas on how is a food safety culture created. Because many of you have probably been on webinars where we talk about food safety culture. And if you're like me, I'll be very candid with you. I'm starting to get a little bit dissatisfied because a lot of them just seem to be what I call a little bit bubblegum like, meaning light, bumper sticker like. Uh, and we never get to the how. The last question being the most important, which is okay, we all think it's important. We all think it's about simply communication, but it's so much more than that. So, what is a food safety culture? If we had time, I'd ask you to define it, write it on a piece of paper. I do this in a course that I teach at Michigan State University. I also teach workshops on food safety culture. I've taught a host of them over the past year in many countries. And the reason I like to do this is if I were to ask you to define pH, let's say, for example, or water activity, what I find is the definitions that come back are very similar, consistent. But in the early days, when I asked people to define food safety culture, when I first started teaching this course 10 years ago, I would get very different definitions. People would say food safety culture is kind of vague and abstract. It's hard to define. So let me give you one definition that I like. The point is not for you to memorize this definition, but understand these important elements that are in the definition. A food safety culture is shared patterns of thought and behavior. It's shared, meaning it's part of the social group. Shared patterns of thought and behavior that characterize this social group. Remember that social group. It's not individual behavior, but the behaviors of people that make up a social group, whether it's people in your company or people in this town or people in a country. And what do they think about food safety? You know, is it something that's important to them? Is it part of their values and belief system? How do they behave in your company? Do employees know if they're having symptoms of gastrointestinal illnesses, they shouldn't come to work? Or do they know if they see something that's unsafe, they should report it and there's no punitive consequences? Do they know that they should wash their hands? Do they know when they should be conducting the appropriate checks? Another part of this definition I like is it's learned through socialization processes. One of the things I like to say, can you believe that food safety can be caught and not only taught? You can catch it. You can catch it. Food safety can be caught, not only taught. You see, because humans are social beings, we tend to do what other people do. And so if you're working in an organization where a lot of people are adhering to the right practices, it'll influence new employees and other employees because everyone else is doing it. And the last thing I like about this definition is that if food safety is really part of the organizational culture, it persists through time, as opposed to being what I call, if you think about it as the program, this year's focus or the flavor of the month. That doesn't last for any duration or significant period of time. And so these are elements of culture that are different than a program. So hopefully you have a better understanding of what a food safety culture is and can explain it to people in your organization and the leaders. Now, why the focus on food safety culture? Well, think about a catastrophic event that's happened that's resulted in loss of human life or property damage. And when those incidents have happened, and they happen in countries around the world, and we hire in countries and governments, what they'll do is they'll assemble investigatory panels, some of the smartest men and women in those domains to go investigate why it happened. And what do they generally conclude? Is it that they didn't design it right, that somebody made an error, that we didn't train them right and we have to retrain them? How many times have you heard that in your company? Or is it organizational culture? It's always organizational culture. Remember this picture I showed you at the beginning. In 2003, this space shuttle was a Space Shuttle Columbia, took off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And shortly after takeoff, I don't know if you can see the pointer on the slides, but these two tanks to the right and left, white tanks, were filled with fuel to provide the thrust needed to get the shuttle into space. Some of the insulation material from one of the fuel tanks came off and hit the leading edge of the left wing. At that time, it wasn't known, but that insulation material, when it hit the leading edge of the left wing, it caused a microscopic fracture that could not be seen with the naked eye, could not be seen with cameras that were on the launch pads. The space shuttle did its mission for a period of days in space, and then it was decided to bring this space shuttle home. Because the leading edge of the left wing had this microscopic crack, when the shuttle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, it experienced a tremendous amount of heat. It always does when vehicles go from space and come back into the Earth's atmosphere. And so the underbelly of that shuttle was lined with thermal insulation tiles. But because it now was cracked ever so slightly that you could only see under a microscope, that section of the wing started to experience a lot of heat. It started to vibrate, and eventually the wing and the entire shuttle came apart, as well as the death of all 7 astronauts that were on board. Tragic incident. The United States did what many countries do when there's these type of catastrophic events. They put together some of the smartest men and women to investigate why this shuttle disaster happened. And they wrote 2 very thick reports. In fact, in my office that I'm sitting here today, right on my bookshelf in front of me, I have the 2 volumes. I read this report in 2004. This was 20 years ago. And I can still tell you to this day this one sentence that jumped out at me. I haven't memorized, but I'm going to share it with you. And this panel concluded that in our view, the NASA organizational culture had as much to do with this accident as the foam. Think about that. It wasn't just the mechanical engineering. It wasn't just about the physics of the material that they use, but the accident had as much to do with culture than it did physics. And it's always the case. You pick your catastrophe. When they happen and they get investigated, again, by the smartest thinkers, this is what's always concluded. On this first picture on the right, that's the BP oil spill. What did the chief that did that investigation determine? It was a culture of complacency. You see, they didn't just talk about the cheap cement that they chose to purchase to save money and use, but a culture of complacency that allowed those decisions to happen. The center picture is General Motors, one of the world's largest automobile manufacturers. That probe determined it was cultural failings. It wasn't just about the ignition switches. What you see there is a mother and father testifying in front of the US Congress with a picture of their daughter that died. because an ignition switch in an automobile failed. They could have talked a lot about the electrical engineering of that ignition switch, and they did. But they said it was the culture of siloed informations at General Motors that allowed that to happen. And I just shared the shuttle example. And I would suggest to you, colleagues and friends, that in a lot of the foodborne outbreaks that we're reading about, that I shared you with these headlines in the news, that these outbreaks might have as much or more to do with culture than they do the microorganism's ability to contaminate or survive in food. The picture on the top is the Peanut Corporation of America's outbreak associated with peanut butter, caused big changes in the US landscape with the advancement of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And I would suggest that this outbreak had more to do with the culture of that organization than it did salmonella's ability to survive in a low moisture food. I'm a microbiologist. I knew salmonella could survive in low moisture foods for years. The reports thereafter that salmonella could survive at low water activities were totally useless to me because I knew that. Why did this really happen? It wasn't just about its survival. On the bottom left, I can think of two crises with powdered infant formula. Think about the melamine incident years ago with melamine being in powdered infant formula because some producers wanted the infant formula to appear higher in protein content, so they intentionally contaminated it with melamine. Do you think that's a chemistry problem or a cultural problem? And how about more recently in times, illnesses associated with Chronobacter with a large manufacturing plant here in the United States, Abbott powdered infant formula, where at least the custom here in the United States was to test finished product using a low statistical probability sampling plan of n equals 30 samples at 10 grams apiece for a total of 300 grams. And these production runs are huge, 40,000 plus pounds. The probability of detecting Chronobacter using those sampling plans could lead to a culture of complacency. And how about Listeria and ice cream, the Bluebell outbreak? Again, it's not to pick on these brands, but to share the lessons learned and learn from their unfortunate experiences. Could you see where a company might become complacent because you would think, remember I said we have to rethink. Up until then, we thought listeriosis with a product that doesn't support the growth of listeria may be unlikely, leading to a culture of complacency. So while we don't see this in the foodborne outbreak investigation reports, I think culture often plays a role. Now, who creates culture? Well, here's a quote from one of the founding fathers of this discipline of organizational culture called Edgar Schein. Organizational cultures are created by leaders. And one of the most decisive functions of leadership may well be the creation and management, and if and when necessary, the destruction of culture. Cultures generally start at the top and flow downward. Now, let me be clear. I don't want anybody on this webinar to go back to their places of employment and tell their leaders, I think our culture here sucks. And I just heard a speaker by the name of Frank Yiannas that says, you're to blame. The reality is that everybody on this webinar, I think, are leaders, and we all have an obligation to influence and coach upwards as well in the companies and organizations that we work for. And how is a safety culture created? Well, here's a quote from a famous Greek philosopher, and I share that to be funny. It's intended to be humor, but one of the things I have learned over the years is that it is a choice. Every organization has a culture, a strong one or a weak one, and I want each and every one of you to work on food safety culture because you want to prevent the catastrophic event. What I've seen over the course of my career is people will work on culture after they've had a problem. We will provide these slides for you, so I'll go real quickly here through the end. I just wanted you to know that the way you create a food safety culture, the how, is to not just rely on most of our academic training, food science alone. It's really a combination in the behavioral sciences, which are a science in and of themselves, and it's exploded over the past 100 years. So it's food science plus concepts of organizational culture and principles of human behavior. It's not the simplistic view of behavior change, but behavior change is complex. It involves a little bit more of systems thinking, realizing we tend to be too linear in our thinking. We think if we just inspect A, we get a better result B. If we just train A, we get a better outcome on behavior change B. And that's not always the case. Behavior change is very, very complex, as stated by an early behavioral psychologist, B.F. Skinner. So here's what I've learned. No two food safety cultures that are great, and there are some great ones out there. There are the companies that we all want to go look at and learn from. Uh, they're never identical, but I've seen a lot of similar core attributes. And I call these attributes of a food safety culture. You can think of them, some people call them dimensions, elements, but I've seen 5 core attributes that are really important. And we'll go through these fairly quickly. Number 1 is those companies that do a great job with food safety generally have really created clear food safety performance expectations for all employees. 2, they educate and train all their employees on food safety. And it doesn't matter what role you're in, if you're in maintenance or you're in marketing or product development or production, you get trained and educated on your role within the broader system. They communicate food safety frequently. I like to say communication and culture are two sides of the same coin. They establish food safety goals and measurements. And one of the things I want you to know is goal setting, proper goal setting is an art. If we think about food safety culture being largely about human behavior, the goals are the antecedents that will influence or set up the desired behavior. And then if we had time, if you were in a 2-day workshop with me or my semester-long course, we would spend a lot of time. I don't think food safety professionals know how to use measurements or maybe aren't even measuring the right things. And then the last core element that I think is important is they create consequences for food safety behaviors, both positive and negative consequences. And I'll try to very quickly in 5 minutes to allow time for questions, just give you some examples of things that we could and you should go deeper on. But just to tell you that you need to have a culture change model. It's not just about communication. These are 5 core attributes and dimensions that I think are really important. And then you have to work on them. Why are the expectations so important? Well, what do you think is the number one reason why employees don't do what they're supposed to do? Study after study has shown the number one reason why employees don't do what they're supposed to do in many domains is they just don't know what to do. When it comes to food safety, that response is unacceptable. And so one of the things you have to do is make sure employees know what matters most. When I was at Walmart, we created something called the Food Safety High Five. Yeah, there's 101 things they need to know working in the retail store. But we said we want them to know these very well embedded, and we want these to become habits. They have to be clean and healthy. That means they don't come to work if they're ill. They wash their hands when they need to wash their hands. And that third symbol there, we tried to communicate them without words, was you never touch ready to eat foods with your bare hands. Keep it cold, keep it hot, don't cross contaminate. Wash, rinse, and sanitize, and cook it and chill it. Majoring on the majors and making sure all employees know them. Those ought to be based on a good risk assessment. So making sure that they know what are the riskiest things that if they don't do them right will become problems. On the left here, I like to say another thing you should do is link food safety to the values and beliefs of your organization because the behavioral studies show that people are much more likely to do things that are aligned with values than complying with policies. And so at Walmart, they had 3 basic beliefs: respecting the individual, serving customers, and striving for excellence. And worked really hard to tell people we're doing food safety the right way because it's part of our values. If you respect the individual, you have to care about their safety. And then we would tell them what was the desired behavior. And sometimes the best way to change behaviors is through design. And so lots of work you can do around simplifying how people actually do the work. For example, we took a 16-step rotisserie chicken preparation policy and distilled it down to 6 steps. The second core element I told you was about educating and training associates. If we had time, I'd tell you there's a difference between education versus training. Education is a lot of the why, and oftentimes we focus on that, but we have to do the how, the training, and generally that's on the job. Uh, I put together a list of many things you can do to enhance your training and education. Know the difference. Focus on changing behavior. If you're doing training and education and you're not changing behavior, you should probably rethink it. Focus on consequences. Use stories instead of statistics. For example, in the United States, I would not take the approach that many health professionals take. About 48 million Americans experience foodborne illness. There's behavioral science studies that say the power of one generally is more effective told in an effective story than statistics, because statistics make you think, well, how do I have the ability to influence it? So I would tell the story of a child that's experienced the foodborne illness related to the type of product my company was producing. Teach food safety, both not only what they need to do at work, but maybe some at-home principles might make it stick. I would leverage behavioral science principles. There's a behavioral science principle of commitment, which says if I commit to something verbally or in writing, I'm more likely to do it. So when I do training, as opposed to getting a signature to have a record of the training being completed, I have people sign or commit to me in writing or verbally that they're going to practice what I've taught them. Make it the social norm. How many of you shop on Amazon? When you shop on Amazon, do you look for the products that have 5 stars or 2 stars? You look for 5 stars. Why is that? That's the principle of social norm. If everybody else is saying it's okay or this is good, you can take a mental shortcut and choose this product must be better than the one with 2 stars. And so what this means to food safety is if I want to show a proper practice or behavior, let's say hand washing, I would never create a hand washing video that showed hand washing the right way with one person. In my video, I would have 3 or 4 people that look like the people that work in that company washing their hands because it conveys the social norm. And you can teach by leveraging the mistakes others have made. That means you can teach experience as opposed to just teaching knowledge. I have a whole lecture on this that one day maybe we can do for you. Hey, the third point I want to make is communicate food safety frequently. Communication and culture are 2 sides of the same coin. What I would suggest is if you want your leaders in your organization to be talking about food safety, you need to arm them with talking points. And I did just that. Every store at every Walmart got weekly talking points to make it easy for the managers to talk about food safety culture. Because if the employees don't hear people talking about it, they'll know it's not part of the culture. Use effective signs and symbols. There's a chapter in my book. A lot of the signs and symbols that we use are really, really poor. Use signs and symbols that are going to be more effective at capturing people's attention. Decide who you want to be your spokesperson. If you look on the bottom left, this is an employee at a Walmart store that I used repeatedly because he was so charismatic to deliver my food safety messages. I, as Frank Yiannas, never wanted to be the one delivering the food safety messages. And in fact, while I had a great team, I never wanted my team to be the one delivering the messages. But this is leveraging a behavioral principle of likeness or homophily, that people will listen to and believe people that are a lot like them. And ask questions. Communication is more than just speaking at people with questions. Goals and measurements. I would just say establish goals because goals follow this ABC model of human behavior. The goal is the antecedent. You have the behavior, the B in the ABC equation, and C in the consequences. I wish we had an hour to talk about metrics. Think about leading indicators versus lagging indicators. What we tend to focus on are lagging indicators. Are there recalls? Are there illnesses? Are there complaints? What are the leading indicators that you should be measuring to prevent the recalls, to prevent the illnesses, to prevent the complaints? Self-checks are more important than third-party checks. So adopt this mental model of a first-party metric, meaning the operations are measuring themselves, and try to convert and rely more on 1P metrics versus third-party metrics, meaning the GFSI audit that's infrequent once a year. And then start digitizing. If we had time, I could share with you how when you digitize, you just transform what you do. And use measurements to, A, catch people doing things right. If you're doing things wrong, you'll correct them, but use measurements with this behavioral science concept of catching people doing things right. And then look at long-term trends, not so that we can see 10 years worth of the trends not changing, but to use those trends to innovate and change processes for better compliance. And then the last thing I'll share, the sixth or the fifth core element is create consequences for food safety performance. I love this quote by BF Center. The consequences of an act affects the probability of occurring again. Food safety professionals, we like to rely and really emphasize negative consequences, punitive consequences, thinking that will change human behavior. We'll write them up, we'll give them violations, we'll give them warnings, we'll give them fines. The behavioral science is clear that in most domains, a ratio of 4 positive consequences to every negative consequences or greater gets better results. It's just human nature. Positive consequences are like free fuel. Think about the classroom studies. Teachers that were just critical and negative all the time didn't create better students, but those teachers that had the right ratio of encouragement to correction. Think about your favorite coaches, your favorite college professors. And so the challenge would be to try to create a tiered recognition process, whether it's on the spot recognition or more formal recognition. And of course, we do have to think about the disciplinary measures when people aren't doing what we expect them to do after we've designed the work the right way, we've given them the skills and education and tools to do it the right way. And if they're still not doing it, then maybe negative consequences are in order. Would love to stay connected. I've given you in 55 minutes a condensed version of a college course that I teach at a graduate level for an entire semester. I sometimes do this as a 1 or 2 day workshop, and maybe we'll work with Nemis to figure out how to do, 1 or 2 day workshop. But here's my website. And let me close with this idea. I know there's a lot of people listening. Some of you work in regulatory and some of you work in the private sector. Some of you work in countries and some of you work in small countries. It doesn't matter where you are. What I've found is that wherever you are, in whatever capacity, you can make a difference. The other thing I've learned, it doesn't matter what seat you're in, public or private, big or small. Alone, we can do so little, but together we can do so much. Thank you all for listening. Been a real pleasure spending some time with you today.
Thank you so much, Frank, for such valuable information. And I'm asking you directly, how much time do you have for questions? Because I see direct is exploding.
Yeah. Well, I know some people, we build this as 1 hour, so people might have to drop
Yeah.
off, but let's go with some questions and I'm willing to go over if necessary.
Yeah, maybe I will take just 5 minutes more. So it's my pleasure to hear that we can plan something with Nemis, some offline workshop.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm for it. And there is also a question coming from audience like, do you find online workshops effective if you do some?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big believer in virtual learning. When I was in school, actually, believe it or not, in my graduate degree, we did some distance learning. And the course that I teach is a mix of distance and in person. So we could do an effective workshop virtually, and you can do effective virtual. There is something special about, doing things in person as well. And so we live in this new virtual world. So if that's the only way you can do it, you do it that way. But to the extent that you can get people together in person, remember I'm talking about the behavioral sciences, and there's something unique about human social interaction. So uh, I still like getting together in person with people when I have to teach or train or deliver a strong message.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And also, actually, someone wrote that I want to be like you when I grow up, Frank.
You
That's
will be better. You will be better. I do believe the next, and this is not to flatter you or encourage you. I do believe the next, we all ride on the shoulders of previous generations. And I do think the next generation of food safety professional, they're going to figure a lot of this out.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And speaking about the overall importance of a strong food safety culture, could you share an example of an organization successfully implementing such culture and what lessons can others take from their journey? You don't need to name brands.
Yeah, no, but I might even name some brands, because I mean this is what we do, right? In my day, we had the Jack in the Box outbreak in the early 90s, and many of you remember Jack in the Box. You know, it was a big outbreak, 800 plus cases. There were kids that died undercooking hamburger patties. And what happened there? They brought in an excellent food safety hero who's passed away, but a good friend of mine, Dave Thino, and they started working not just on programs but culture. And what happened after that outbreak? Everybody went to Jack in the Box. Told them, Jack in the Box, what did you do? Um, you think about Maple Leaf and their experience, and I use them, and what happened there with Randy Huffman, the Canadian deli meat producer. Now everybody wants to know, Maple Leaf, how did you get through that crisis? Chipotle, I'm on the Chipotle Food Safety Advisory Board. They had a series of, and what I found, Alina, is that oftentimes, unfortunately, companies will have a catastrophic event and then they double down and really get better. And that's was my encouragement to folks listening is, hey, create these strong food safety cultures before they are. But a couple of things that all those companies have done is they've worked on culture, not just programs. I would say all of those companies have really doubled down on linking food safety to the values and the beliefs of the organization and not just a program or it being a regulatory requirement. Um, they've done great risk assessments. They've done some of the elements that I've talked about. They've trained and educated all their employees. Maybe they weren't working. They're using better metrics. In essence, I think all those companies have recovered through those because they've doubled down on organizational culture and not just creating a food safety program. I mean, most of they all thought they had programs and they had problems. And so um, if you get an opportunity to benchmark with companies that have been through the crisis, you generally will learn a lot of the changes that they've made.
Yeah, definitely. And also, how do you see, by the way, right now, the influence of emerging technologies like AI, blockchain, or other stuff playing what kind of role they are playing in supporting a system-based approach to food safety?
Yeah, so this is why I said, hey, I think the next generation. And when I was at the FDA, we launched a blueprint and a new strategy called the New Era of Smarter Food Safety, which suggested it was technology based, but it was more than that because we had as one of our four core elements culture. But I think these new and emerging technologies give me great hope. And it's not, and I always say it's not because you're chasing technology. I always say don't chase the shiny coin, but figure out what is the business or public health problem that you're trying to solve. And is there a technology out there that can help you? So distributed ledger blockchain technology, I'm a big believer and used it at Walmart because it helped us to, to execute traceability in a more equitable fashion than having everybody get in a centralized database, a decentralized database. It was easier to get people to participate. But I would say uh, new and emerging technologies has so much promise in a couple areas. One is I'm a big believer in AI because I think we're all in the business of trying to predict and conduct risks and say, what should we be worried about? And AI and machine learning can dramatically enhance your predictive capabilities. I did a pilot when I was at FDA on seafood imports, and we showed we could increase our chances of finding violative seafood shipments by 300%.
Wow.
Think about everybody that's listening. Imagine if you could implement a tool that could dramatically enhance your ability to predict what your next problem might be. The other thing I will say is digital technologies and their role in culture. I believe digital technologies might be one of our best hopes at changing human behavior. And I've seen personally through a handheld auditing system that we gave every employee, how effective that was if you gave the employee a digital prompt, how you change their behavior much faster than the traditional training. Because now you're giving the employee a digital prompt in the palm of their hand that's telling them to do something. something we should all relate for, right? We all have handhelds and we know how these things are influencing our lives. Imagine a digital prompt to try to influence the desired behavior at the right time. And so, I, to make a long story short, I think emerging technology can be used to strengthen organizational culture.
Yeah, I would add that it should be used actually. It should
Hmm.
be used definitely. So if you still have like 5 more
Yep, let's
minutes,
do
we
it.
can.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so there is very interesting question coming from Karen Hobbs. Hi, Karen. This is amazing lady whom I met during one of the events in Europe. So Frank, hopefully I will meet you also in person.
Good.
So, assessing the food safety culture is a must to improve food safety. And as a former inspector for over 2 decades, I felt monotonous and almost robotic, even though I thought I could provide some wisdom to improve the food safety culture. Do you have any advice for frontline inspectors on how they can personally make a difference in food safety culture while following protocols set by agency if they work for whom they work for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for your service. It sounds like you have a long tenured career of trying to improve public health. Thank you for that. Um, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Is number one is I do think even if you're a frontline inspector, that you should spend some time studying the behavioral sciences. I'm not on this webinar to sell books, but I wrote a second book called Food Safety Equals Behavior: 30 Proven Behavioral Science Techniques to Enhance Employee Compliance. And what I did is I scoured the literature, and there are these principles of human behavior that oftentimes food scientists don't think, hey, this isn't real science because you don't measure them with graduated cylinders or as precisely, but directionally they prove concepts of human behavior. And if you can leverage some of these principles of understanding human behavior, you can get better results and influence people. I mentioned one, the principle of commitment. I mentioned the principle of likeness or homophily. I mean, who should be delivering the message to try to influence? I mentioned the principle of social norm. Uh, so I would try to leverage human behavioral sciences, and that's why when I was at FDA, we trained our entire inspectional force on food safety culture because we said we can't regulate food safety culture, but we could certainly leverage some human behavioral science principles in how we do our work. We can certainly recognize culture and we can certainly try to encourage it. So arm yourself with some behavioral science tips that will make you more effective at how you influence and interact with organizations. The second thing I would say, and this might seem very basic and sometimes it seems counterintuitive for an inspector, but I've always told the teams that work for me that inspected it, adopt a mindset that you're going to be auditing. And what's the purpose of auditing? I say it's to try to catch people doing things right. Remember, I told you the importance of positive recognition? Now, I know regulators sometimes get nervous and say, well, Frank, if I see something that's not wrong, I have to cite it and I have to correct it. And the answer is absolutely you do. Nobody's telling you not to. Nobody's asking you to be an overly the top, an easy auditor that gives everybody passing grades. I'm just saying if somebody's doing a good job on something, positively reinforce that. That's like free fuel. You know the price of fuel these days? It's like free fuel, and it incentivizes and encourages that type of behavior. So have a mentality that I'm going to try to catch people doing things right. If I see something that's not right, I'm going to fix it. And I can tell you, whenever I walked into a Walmart store, I went in with my positive recognition cards. There were times that I walked out of a store and never gave one of those cards away because I didn't like what I saw. But I really strove to try to catch somebody doing something right.
Thank you, Frank. And if we have a minute for the last question, because
Sure.
I noticed that it's kind of repetitive one from a couple of attendees, in terms of the importance of coaching C-level and leadership in general, how
Yeah.
would company do it, and what are the key steps?
Well, the leadership question is a good one. And one of the things I often say is that when I have made career transitions, and it sounds like I've made a lot of them, I haven't. I tend to stay in organizations for a quite long period of time. Now I'm consulting, obviously, working with a lot of organizations. But believe it or not, when I do a career transition, Oftentimes, food safety professionals are very focused on the risk assessments, the HACCP plans, the checks, the gaps of the current management framework. Um, I probably, when I do the transition, Alina, have more focus on the leadership, meaning the CEO and the board and the leadership team, the executive leadership team, than I do laterally with the mid-level leaders and with the front level leaders. I actually try to look at all the different stakeholder groups, but my first real interest is in that executive leadership group. And so I leverage some of these behavioral science principles that you're hearing me talk about today. Is I try to, if the company hasn't talked about food safety as part of their values and beliefs, I figure out a way on how to link it. I've done this with brands such as Amazon, with Walmart, Disney, and others. I then tell the executives and teach and train them that, listen, you got to do food safety the right way, not because it's required by law, but if your values and beliefs are true, and if you can link it to the organization's values and beliefs, then you have an obligation to do that. That's a behavioral science principle. I leverage the principle of commitment. So very early on, I try to get an executive or two, ideally the CEO, to do something publicly, whether verbally or written, because what does that do to that CEO? The principle of commitment says that once I say something publicly, or if I commit to something publicly in writing, it influences my own behaviors. I'm more likely to do
Yeah.
that because nobody wants to be viewed as a flip-flopper. So I don't want you to think I'm being manipulative, but I try to hook the leaders of the organizations to be committed to food safety using the principle of commitment. Um, and I would go straight to the top really quick and try to get them on board.
Yeah, that's definitely a solution. And thank you everyone who joined our session today. Unfortunately, guys, I do apologize that we cannot cover every single question today because of a tremendous number of attendees. However, in advance, I invite everyone to join our offline session. Hopefully, it's planned to happen either fall or end of summer. We will discuss it with Frank. And thank you very much, Frank, for joining us today, for being our speaker.
My
Wishing you an
pleasure.
amazing day. Wishing to everyone who is in US a brilliant day, who is in Europe, brilliant evening, and see you in our future Academy webinars, which will be actually in already 2 weeks. See you guys, and just have amazing day, evening. Bye.
Great. Thanks. Stay safe.
Stay safe. Bye.